Winter, 1943. The sky over England was a frozen battlefield. Ice clung to every surface, oxygen masks fogged with each breath. And below, the patchwork of countryside vanished in the mist. Above, 30 B-17 bombers clawed their way toward Germany, their aluminum hulls rattling under the strain of engines, gunners, and endless fear. And then, from the grey haze, 14 German fighters appeared, diving like shadows of death. Inside the lead bomber, tension hung heavier than the fuel in their tanks. The gunners tracked the enemy, hearts pounding, fingers trembling on triggers. The formation flinched with every tracer, every distant explosion. Survival was a gamble, and the odds were stacked mercilessly against them. Then a lone voice cut through the radio static, calm but unnervingly confident. First Lieutenant James Howard, their escort pilot, wasn't following the rules. He wasn't circling, he wasn't waiting for backup. He was climbing straight toward the storm, a Mustang streaking like a silver bullet into the path of death. His crew stared in disbelief. To them, he was insane. One man against 14 seasoned Luftwaffe fighters? Impossible. But Howard didn't hesitate. He knew something they didn't. He had seen the angles, calculated the risks, and found a solution no manual could teach. In that frozen sky, with metal screaming and bullets streaking past, Howard made a choice that defied every protocol. For the next few minutes, the air became a chessboard of fire and steel. Every maneuver, every split-second decision could mean life or death, not just for him, but for the 30 bombers he swore to protect. By the time the smoke cleared, what the Luftwaffe reported back would spread through German intelligence like wildfire. One lone Mustang had stopped 14 attackers cold, and for the crews below, survival had a name. The European sky in late 1943 was no place for hesitation. The 8th Air Force had committed to daylight precision bombing, a strategy that promised surgical strikes on German industrial targets but demanded perfection from every crew. In theory, waves of B-17 flying fortresses would sweep across the Reich, destroy factories, railways and military installations, and return home under the protective umbrella of their own guns and the few escort fighters available. In practice, it was pure carnage. Bomber crews were a mix of farm boys, factory workers, and college students. Many of them barely 20 years old. They had volunteered or been drafted into a war that would toss them into the heart of enemy territory with minimal training, relying on rigid formations, disciplined gunners, and sheer luck. They learned quickly that every mission carried a price, and that price was often measured in blood and burning metal. Wings sheared off, engines caught fire, and men plummeted from the sky. Death could be sudden, brutal, and absolute. The German Luftwaffe exploited every weakness. Messerschmitt Bf 109 seconds and Focke-Wulf 190 seconds attacked from above, below, and head-on, closing at speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour. Their cannon fire could shred aluminum, engines, and crew alike before a single American round reached them. Loss rates were staggering. Some missions saw 1 in 5 bombers destroyed. The gunners knew it. The pilots knew it, and every new flight of men understood it before the first engine even started. Into this crucible of steel and smoke stepped First Lieutenant James Howard. Unlike most young pilots, he was 30 years old, experienced and unshakably calm under pressure. Born in Canton, China, to missionary parents, he had grown up surrounded by problem-solving and adaptability. Early ambition had taken him toward pre-med studies in California, but the sky pulled harder. He joined the Navy as an aviation cadet in 1937, washed out due to a minor medical disqualification, then went to China to fly with the Flying Tigers. There he honed his instincts against Japanese bombers and fighters, learning to exploit every advantage, to fight smarter, and to survive when outnumbered. By the time he arrived in England, Howard was not flashy, nor did he seek glory. He studied enemy tactics, mission reports, and formation dynamics with a level of detail that bewildered his younger squadron mates. To them, he was competent, calm, and strangely fearless, a man who seemed more interested in solving equations in the air than chasing kills. The mission that January morning was simple in theory, but deadly in execution: escort a formation of B-17s deep into Germany, reach the target, and bring every bomber back safely. The distance pushed the limits of the P-51 Mustang, their sleek new fighters barely capable of staying with the bombers until the edge of enemy territory. Clouds thickened over the North Sea, Radio signals crackled with static, and the bomber stream began to stretch, a vulnerable thread through hostile skies. And then the first German fighters appeared, climbing through the haze. The mission fractured in seconds, dogfights erupted, formations splintered, and the chaos of battle claimed every ounce of training. For the isolated bombers drifting ahead, death was seconds away, and Howard faced a choice no doctrine had prepared him for: retreat to safety, or confront overwhelming odds alone. The bomber stream was no longer a single disciplined unit. Clouds and haze had stretched it into a fragile, drifting line of metal and human nerves. Below, the English countryside disappeared, replaced by the grey expanse of the North Sea, and beyond it, the heart of Germany. Howard's eyes scanned the skies, tracking every glint of aluminum and the distant contrails of enemy fighters. Then he saw them, an isolated group of B-17s, 30 heavy bombers drifting west of the main formation, dangerously exposed. No escort fighters were near. The rest of his squadron had been pulled into scattered dogfights against waves of Focke-Wulf 192nds and Messerschmitt Bf 109nds. The bombers were moving blindly into the teeth of the Luftwaffe, their gunners ready but powerless against a coordinated attack. Seconds could decide whether they lived or died. Howard assessed the situation quickly. Fuel was limited, radio communications were full of static, and the nearest friendly fighters were minutes away, if they even noticed the threat in time. Outnumbered 10-1, maybe more, he realized that the choice before him was brutal but simple. He could turn back and survive, or dive into the chaos and give the bombers a chance. The calculation was cold, precise, and horrifying in its stakes. Without hesitation, he shoved the throttle forward. The Mustang lunged into the void, a silver arrow cutting toward the drifting bombers. The Germans had not yet committed to the attack, still positioning and coordinating. Howard had one advantage, the element of surprise. One lone fighter could move faster and unpredictably, and he intended to exploit it fully. Bullets began to streak through the air. The sound was deafening. Cannon fire ripping aluminum, tracer rounds marking deadly arcs, gunners shouting over the roar of engines. Howard rolled hard, diving into the first attack run, firing short bursts that tore through the wing of a German fighter. Smoke spiraled from the enemy aircraft as the others scrambled, momentarily confused. He was no longer a lone pilot. He was a moving obstacle, a puzzle the Germans had to solve before they could reach the bombers. Minutes stretched like hours. Howard matched the bombers' speed, slipping inside the former. In defiance of every doctrine, pilots were trained to stay outside, to protect from a distance. Close escort was considered reckless, suicidal even. But he had calculated the angles. The head-on attacks the Luftwaffe relied on required a straight line and high speed. By placing himself directly in the path, Howard forced the enemy into impossible choices: break off or risk a collision. From the bombers, gunners hesitated, then began coordinating with him. They held their fire, recognizing him as their shield. Calls crackled over the radio, a spontaneous and unspoken alliance forming under fire. Each German attack met resistance. Each dive ended in frustration. Fuel was burning fast, adrenaline surging, muscles screaming under the strain of relentless maneuvers. Howard had become both protector and weapon, calculating every movement, every shot, every adjustment with split-second precision. And all the while, the Germans regrouped, returning again and again, only to find their path blocked by one man's courage and his genius. Howard dove deeper into the chaos, his Mustang cutting through the grey winter sky like a blade. Enemy fighters swarmed, but he didn't flinch. He didn't chase. He became a moving shield, weaving between bombers, matching their speed, anticipating every head-on attack. Every German pilot who closed on the formation now faced an impossible choice: risk collision with a fighter determined to block their path, or break off and let the bombers live. Two Focke-Wulfs dove from above, noses aimed at a lead B-17. Howard rolled hard, throttled back and fired a short burst. One fighter spiraled out of control, smoke trailing from its wing. The second broke off in confusion. The German pilots had not accounted for him, for the sheer audacity of a Mustang flying inside a bomber formation. Howard's gunners kept their fingers ready but waited, recognizing instinctively that he was the solution, not a threat. Another wave came from the starboard side. Howard pivoted, rolling, diving, and forcing them into defensive maneuvers that shattered their attack vectors. Tracers sliced through the sky, explosions rattled the aluminum of both allies and enemies. Each attack he disrupted bought precious seconds for the bombers, and each second brought them closer to survival. Minutes stretched endlessly, a relentless ballet of fire and steel. Howard's fuel burned dangerously low. His hands ached from gripping the controls, his vision tunneled from oxygen debt, but he didn't slow. He matched every dive, every turn, every high-speed pass with mathematical precision. One wrong move would send him spiraling into death, or worse, into the bomber formation he was sworn to protect. Then came the moment that would define the mission. Howard slid his Mustang into the very heart of the bomber formation, positioning directly in front of the lead B-17. Every textbook warned against this: turbulence, prop wash, friendly fire, but he had calculated the physics, the angles, the enemy psychology. The Germans, expecting a clear run, hesitated, unsure whether to commit. A Messerschmitt rolled in, guns blazing, closing at terrifying speed. Howard waited until the last possible instant, then fired. The German flinched, veered off, and pulled away. Another followed. He climbed, rolled, and returned to his position, slightly ahead of the lead bomber, a living shield. The crews below began to recognize what he had become. Their protector, fearless and unyielding, daring the enemy to come closer. Attack after attack, Howard met them, forcing overshoots, splitting formations, turning the Germans' own speed against them. The unplanned partnership between one Mustang and 30 bombers became seamless. Gunners adjusted, communicated, coordinated, and together he created chaos for the enemy. By the time Howard's fuel dipped below reserve, the Luftwaffe began to disengage. Not a retreat, they were calculating the risk. But the bomber crews were safe. Every dive, every cannon burst, every evasive maneuver had bought them life. Howard, exhausted, fuel nearly gone, finally eased his Mustang out of the formation, a silent hero who had rewritten the rules of engagement in real time. The sky finally seemed to breathe around them, but the tension didn't fade. The bomber crews could hardly believe what they had just witnessed. One Mustang, piloted by a single man, had thrown himself into the path of death and bent the laws of air combat to his will. James Howard wasn't just flying, he was orchestrating survival, turning fear into strategy, chaos into a defensive weapon. Inside the bombers, gunners exchanged stunned glances. Fingers still hovered over triggers, eyes scanning for threats, but they instinctively adjusted to Howard's maneuvers. Each crew member realized that for the first time in the war, they weren't alone in the sky. They had a guardian, a living shield who had redefined what it meant to escort. The unspoken coordination formed immediately. When Howard rolled low and centered in front of the formation, gunners held fire. When he engaged an enemy dive, they tracked threats through his eyes. It was instinctive, unplanned, and flawless. The Germans, on the other hand, were bewildered. Reports later would call it confusion, hesitation, a shadow of fear they had rarely encountered. Their head-on attacks, honed to devastating efficiency, were nullified by the audacity of one lone pilot. The rules of engagement that had worked flawlessly against formations for months were suddenly useless. One Mustang, one human mind, had become a living barrier, a problem they couldn't solve without risking collision or death. Howard's own bod. WWII was screaming. Every maneuver pushed fuel consumption to the edge. Every roll, dive, and climb demanded maximum control and concentration. The Mustang shuddered under the stress, bullets puncturing wings and fuselage, but the engine held. His vision tunneled, hands cramped, lungs burning in the thin, freezing air. Yet his mind remained a precise calculator. Every angle, every vector, every enemy position was accounted for. Mistakes could be fatal, but he did not make them. Below, the B-17s maintained formation, responding to the presence of a protector they didn't fully understand. The crew's confidence grew with each thwarted attack, their gunners adjusting to Howard's rhythm, learning to anticipate the maneuvers of both friend and foe. What had begun as disbelief evolved into awe. One man had become more than a fighter pilot, he had become a force multiplier, turning the limitations of doctrine into an advantage. Time stretched into a surreal rhythm of action and reaction. Enemy fighters regrouped, attempted coordinated passes, but each assault met the same unyielding barrier. Howard forced them into overshoots, miscalculations, and missed opportunities. What could have been slaughter became a brutal chess match. Every engagement tested physics, human endurance, and nerve. Yet Howard remained the fulcrum, the axis around which the battle turned. Minutes felt like hours, adrenaline sustaining a body pushed to the absolute limits of fatigue, and when the Germans finally began to pull away, calculating that the risk of continued engagement outweighed the chance of success, the bomber crews realized the full scope of what had happened. They had survived against overwhelming odds, not by superior numbers, but because one man refused to follow the rules, and instead applied logic, courage, and instinct in a way no one had ever taught. The winter sky remained grey, silent. Now except for the hum of engines, the whine of propellers, and the distant echo of what had been a war fought at breakneck speed and impossible odds. Howard, alone, had shifted the balance. As Howard eased his Mustang out of the formation, the reality of the mission began to settle in. Fuel was nearly gone, the engine wheezing under the strain of maneuvers that had pushed it to the edge, and every part of his body ached from adrenaline, cold, and sheer exhaustion. Yet there was no time for reflection. Not yet. The English coast appeared through the haze, a thin line of green and brown breaking the grey, and with it came the hope of landing alive. Touching down at the nearest airfield, Howard rolled to a stop, engine dying as ground crews rushed forward. They found a Mustang riddled with bullet holes, wings, fuselage, tail, but an intact pilot, silently climbing out. Howard spoke little, describing the mission in precise, measured words: bomber formation, German attackers, defensive maneuvers. There was no exaggeration, no flourish. To him, it was problem-solving executed to the best of his ability. Inside the bombers, crews were landing in waves, shaken but alive. They recounted the story again and again. One Mustang had flown inside the formation, absorbed attacks meant for them, and disrupted the Luftwaffe's deadly precision. Some described 14 attackers, others claimed more. All agreed on one fact: without Howard, they would not have returned. Relief, awe, and gratitude filled every crew member. The quiet, methodical pilot who had joined them for the mission had become their guardian angel. Word reached 8th Air Force headquarters quickly. Intelligence officers reviewed Howard's report, cross-referenced it with the bomber crew's debriefs, and analyzed the tactical implications. What he had done was a clear violation of doctrine, reckless by the book, but it had worked. Losses that day were prevented, and a new possibility emerged. Escort fighters could influence enemy attacks not just through firepower, but by positioning, by presence, by daring to enter the space no one expected. In the immediate aftermath, bomber crews spoke of Howard as more than a hero. He had rewritten the understanding of escort defense in real time. Pilots who had trained for months in standard tactics began to question assumptions. Could close-in maneuvers, once considered suicidal, become a controlled, calculated tool to protect bombers? Howard's logic, applied under extreme pressure, had exposed a flaw in German tactics. Head-on attacks were powerful, but they relied on predictable paths and gaps that a single, intelligent pilot could exploit. Howard himself did not dwell on heroism. He filed the necessary reports, maintained calm, and prepared for the next mission. To him, the event was a solution to a problem, not a story of glory. But the bomber crew's memories were vivid and permanent. They recounted the Mustang flying through their formation, absorbing danger and forcing the enemy to hesitate. They had survived a mission that would have been almost certainly fatal without him. By the end of the day, a subtle shift had begun. Pilots and gunners alike had learned a lesson not found in any manual. Courage combined with logic, precise positioning, and understanding of the enemy could tip the balance. The mission was over, the immediate danger gone, but its lessons and Howard's brilliance would echo through the skies of Europe for months to come. Weeks after that fateful mission, the ripples of Howard's actions began reaching beyond the bomber crews he had saved. At 8th Air Force headquarters, intelligence officers pored over mission reports, bomber debriefs, and gun camera footage. The realization was undeniable. Howard had not only preserved lives, he had exposed a tactical vulnerability in the Luftwaffe's most feared weapon, the head-on attack. One man in one Mustang had changed the dynamics of air combat over Europe. Recognition followed, but Howard did not seek it. In April 1944, he was awarded the Medal of Honor, the only fighter pilot in the European theater to receive the nation's highest military decoration for bomber escort defense. The citation praised courage, skill, and devotion, yet it barely captured the true genius of his actions. Howard had not simply flown into danger, he had calculated it, manipulated it, and weaponized it. He had taken chaos and imposed order, turning a near-certain disaster into a textbook of innovation. The bomber crews who had lived through that winter sky spoke in hushed tones of the Mustang that refused to leave them. Letters arrived weeks later, heartfelt thanks crossing the Atlantic. "We survived because of you," they wrote. "You weren't just flying, you were thinking, protecting, calculating every move when the rest of us could only pray." Howard read them quietly, offering modest replies, never embellishing the story, never claiming heroism. For him, it had been pure logic, not glory. But the impact was tangible. Fighter pilots began training closer to bombers, testing positioning strategies that Howard had demonstrated in the heat of battle. Doctrine evolved, not to replicate a suicidal solo run, but to incorporate the principle that presence, timing, and anticipation could disrupt enemy attacks more effectively than sheer firepower alone. Escort tactics shifted subtly, then decisively. Loss rates for bombers began to drop, crew morale improved, and the Luftwaffe, once confident in their head-on attacks, now hesitated, adapting to an invisible threat that had redefined the battlefield. Howard himself returned to combat, flying additional missions, mentoring younger pilots and quietly refining the tactics he had improvised. He did not seek recognition, nor did he boast of the Medal of Honor. To him, flying was about precision, logic, and survival, yet his influence spread, imperceptible at first, then undeniable. Pilots who survived because of his tactics would carry his lessons into every engagement, passing them on, teaching them, and ensuring that one man's courage and intellect had changed the course of the war. The Germans noticed too. Captured intelligence reports referenced the Americans who refused to leave bomber formations, pilots who stayed close under fire, disrupting every attack with precision. Howard had created a new nightmare in the skies of Europe, not by shooting down planes but by making the enemy hesitate, miscalculate, and fail. In doing so, he had shifted the balance, proving that innovation, courage, and timing could be more powerful than numbers, more decisive than brute force. Even after the Medal of Honor ceremony, Howard returned to the skies quietly, without fanfare. The WWII of 1944 was relentless, and bomber missions over Germany continued to be some of the deadliest in the war. But something had changed. Escort pilots now flew with a new awareness, a sharpened understanding of Howard's lesson. Presence and positioning could alter outcomes in ways raw firepower never could. Bomber crews noticed immediately. The familiar tension of each mission remained, but now there was a sense of calculated protection, a rhythm that had not existed before. Gunners scanned the skies with confidence, calling out threats, adjusting their fire to complement the fighters who now stayed closer, moving not just as defenders, but as active disruptors. The crew's trust in the escorts grew. They felt safer, more empowered, and more willing to push toward objectives that had once seemed suicidal. Howard continued to fly among them, his presence steady, deliberate, and always calculated. He never sought attention. His squadron mates admired his calm, noting how he could remain focused under relentless pressure, calculating trajectories, intercepting attacks, and communicating with crews using minimal words. He became a living example of applied strategy, an embodiment of the principle that survival in combat required more than courage, it required intellect and anticipation. The Luftwaffe, meanwhile, was adjusting, but not fast enough. Intelligence reports referenced American fighters who stayed inside formations, pilots who blocked attacks, and crews who coordinated with their escorts. German pilots, once confident in their head-on assaults, found themselves facing an unpredictable force. Hesitation crept in. Attacks that had once been precise and deadly now encountered resistance that they could not easily calculate. Losses, though still high, began to show slight but meaningful reductions. For Howard, each mission reinforced the lesson of January 11th. Cora. GE without logic was chaos. Logic without courage was useless. He trained younger pilots, teaching them to think dynamically, to anticipate enemy behavior, and to integrate seamlessly with bomber crews. The Mustang became more than a fighter. It became a tool for strategy, for disruption, for protection. The human element, the ability to read the battlefield, understand variables, and act decisively, was now a weapon as lethal as any cannon. Back in the bombers, The crews began to share stories, letters, and debriefs about the Mustang pilots who stayed close, who protected them in ways that changed missions from death sentences into survivable operations. Howard's actions became legend among them, not for glory, but because one man had proven that the impossible could be done, that lives could be saved, and that a single mind in the right place at the right time could alter the course of a battle. The lesson spread quietly but effectively. Pilots who survived because of Howard carried the knowledge into future missions, training others, instilling awareness, and reinforcing a culture of calculated courage. The skies remained dangerous, but now there was hope. One man's audacity, precision, and clarity had created a ripple that would save countless lives and change the way the war was fought at high altitude over Europe. The impact of Howard's actions extended far beyond that single mission. Within weeks, bomber escort doctrine began to shift. Close-in maneuvers once considered reckless were now studied carefully, adapted, and integrated where feasible. Pilots were trained to anticipate enemy head-on attacks, position themselves to block the most dangerous vectors, and use their presence as a tool to disrupt coordinated assaults. Howard had demonstrated that strategy, timing, and courage could compensate for numerical inferiority. Bomber crews noticed the difference immediately. Missions that would have once been nerve-wracking, almost suicidal, now carried a glimmer of hope. Escorts stayed closer, communicated more effectively, and moved with intent, rather than simply circling defensively. Crew morale improved, and confidence grew. Letters, journal entries, and debriefs from that winter reflected a recurring theme: we survived because of him. Howard's actions became a benchmark for coordination and tactical thinking, and bomber crews internalized the lesson, flying missions with a sense of strategic partnership they had never experienced before. The Luftwaffe, meanwhile, was forced to adjust. Intelligence reports described American fighters refusing to remain on the fringes, instead challenging head-on attacks and forcing pilots to rethink their tactics. The Germans were no longer facing only firepower. They faced unpredictability, awareness, and precision thinking. Howard had introduced a new variable into the aerial equation, a human mind that refused to follow convention, whose presence altered outcomes without necessarily firing a single shot. Howard himself remained modest. He continued flying missions, training new pilots, and mentoring young officers, but never sought attention or accolades. To him, the Medal of Honor was a recognition of duty, not a celebration of heroism. Yet the ripple effect of that single mission became permanent. Escort strategies evolved, pilot training incorporated lessons from his maneuver, and bomber survival rates improved. His logic, applied under extreme conditions, had shifted the culture of aerial warfare. Years later, the bomber crews who survived that winter still spoke of Howard with reverence. They described the Mustang flying inside their formation, the calm determination of its pilot, and the moments of clarity that allowed them to survive when every rule, every doctrine, said they should not. The story of one man protecting 30 bombers against overwhelming odds became part of the oral tradition of the 8th Air Force. Instructors recounted it, new pilots studied it, and the lesson endured: courage paired with intellect can bend the rules of war, saving lives and changing outcomes. Howard's legacy was not in kills, numbers, or statistics. It was in presence, calculation, and the audacity to defy expectations. He proved that one individual, using strategy and logic under pressure, could tilt the balance of a battle. In a war defined by mass formations, attrition, and overwhelming force, Howard had shown that precision of mind could be as lethal as precision of fire. The skies of Europe would never be quite the same. James Howard survived the war and returned to a quiet life, far from the spotlight that might have tempted another man. He continued serving in the Air Force, rising to the rank of Brigadier General before retiring in 1966 after nearly 30 years of service. Despite the Medal of Honor and the countless lives he had saved, Howard rarely spoke of that January mission. To him, it had been a matter of logic and duty, a solution to a problem, not a story of heroism. Yet those who had flown with him never forgot. Bomber crews shared the story for decades, recalling the Mustang that refused to leave formation, the pilot who turned himself into a living shield, and the daring maneuvers that defied doctrine and expectation. generations of pilots learned from the echoes of that mission. The principles of positioning, anticipation and courage that Howard had demonstrated under fire, even enemy pilots remembered. Captured reports from the Luftwaffe referenced American fighters who stayed inside formations, who disrupted attacks with precision and timing. Howard had not only saved lives, he had altered the tactics of both sides, leaving a mark on the air war that could not be measured in medals alone. When Howard passed away in 1995 at the age of 81, veterans from both bombers and fighters attended his funeral. They spoke of his courage, his intellect, and the lesson he had imparted, that one man, thinking clearly and acting decisively, could change the course of a battle. In the vast theatre of World War II, James Howard proved that the most powerful weapon in war is not firepower, not luck, but a mind willing to see what others cannot, and act when it matters most.